She had always imagined marriage as the beginning of something gentle, like settling into a warm home after years of wandering through cold weather. The man she loved had a quiet strength, someone who didn't overwhelm the room, but filled it with stability. When he proposed, it felt like she was being offered a chance at peace, and she said yes with her whole heart. After the wedding, things moved quickly. They found a small apartment on the edge of town, filled it with soft light, and painted the walls the color of calm. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. She filled the space with little touches. A vase of wildflowers by the window, shelves lined with books she loved, a teapot that whistled like an old friend. Life was still, uneventful, and warm. His family, though, came with different energy. Loud, proud, and always on the edge of something unspoken. She had met them before briefly, but becoming part of their circle was different from visiting. Now she had to navigate the currents beneath their polite smiles and sharp eyes. Still, she tried. Every weekend she showed up at their home with a dish she had cooked, a gift wrapped in thoughtful paper, or just her best smile. She listened more than she spoke. She laughed at jokes she didn't find funny, and ignored the way her name was sometimes mispronounced or how her ideas were gently redirected. It wasn't exactly welcoming, but she believed they would warm to her. People needed time. Her mother-in-law stood at the center of the family, like an iron post wrapped in lace. She ran every event, decided who was invited, and set the tone of every room. Nothing escaped her. There was a way she asked questions that felt more like assessments, always layered beneath the surface. How long had they been trying? Did she feel ready for motherhood? Had she spoken to a doctor? The words came wrapped in concern, but they landed like weights. Still, she smiled and answered. She wanted to be liked. She wanted to be good. The husband didn't see it, or maybe he chose not to. To him, his family was just family, slightly overbearing, maybe, but ultimately harmless. She didn't push it. She didn't want to be the wife who made him choose. So she stayed silent, tucked her discomfort into quiet corners, and kept showing up. She told herself it would get easier, that love and patience were enough to turn strangers into kin. She didn't realize yet that some people don't want to love you. They want to test how much you'll take before you break. And so, for a while, everything looked fine from the outside. They had dinners. They toasted birthdays. She posed for family photos with a soft smile. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. Like the ground had begun to tilt, almost imperceptibly, under her feet. It began with small things so subtle they were easy to dismiss. A forgotten introduction at a family gathering. A gift she brought that was left unopened on the kitchen counter. The way her words were interrupted mid-sentence during dinner conversations, as if her voice held no weight in the room. At first she blamed herself. Maybe she wasn't trying hard enough. Maybe she wasn't warm enough, clever enough, interesting enough to command their attention. She tried harder, dressed more carefully, baked their favorite desserts, researched topics her in-laws liked so she could hold a conversation that might linger longer than a passing glance. But no matter how much effort she poured in, she was always just outside the circle, close enough to observe but never truly allowed in. Her husband didn't seem to notice. He would laugh with his father over sports, lean into his mother's side hugs, offer to fix things around the house before she had taken off her coat. When she mentioned the strange energy, he brushed it off with a smile, called them quirky, said they were just being themselves. And maybe they were. Maybe their way of being was this: dominating a room, controlling its pace, then acting surprised when someone dared to feel left behind. She wondered how he could not see the shift in her posture, the tightening of her voice when they walked through the door to his childhood home. But love makes people blind to things they'd rather not confront. It escalated slowly. His sister once commented that she looked a little tired, with a glance that lingered too long on the circles under her eyes. His aunt teased her about her slow oven, hinting at their lack of children with a smirk that never reached her eyes. During a game night, she noticed a shared look pass between family members when she lost a round. A kind of silent communion that left her feeling as though she had failed an unspoken test. The air around them thickened with a kind of passive hostility, one that didn't rely on direct insults, but rather on a quiet, constant erosion of dignity. Still, she endured. She told herself that families were complicated, that time would soften the edges, that their jokes, though cutting, weren't meant to wound. But then came the baby blanket, gifted to her in front of everyone. It was pastel blue with tiny bears stitched into the corners. Her mother-in-law handed it to her with a smile too polished to be sincere. Everyone laughed when she opened it, clapped even, as if it were a charming inside joke. She forced a smile, her hands trembling as she folded the fabric neatly back into the box. That night, she cried in the car on the way home, her face turned toward the window, hoping her husband wouldn't hear. She began to dread every visit. Her stomach tightened at the thought of another meal where her opinions would be brushed aside, or her existence reduced to a prop in their performance of familial harmony. She started noticing how her presence was always filtered through someone else's narrative, introduced as the quiet one, spoken about in third person even while she stood in the room, pitted for her shyness, instead of seen for her restraint. She wanted to scream sometimes, to shake the air with her truth, but she knew how it would look. Emotional, difficult, unreasonable, and that would be all the justification they needed to push her further out. The man she married remained caught in the space between two realities, hers and theirs. He didn't see the smirks exchanged behind her back or the carefully timed comments designed to disorient her. He saw only smiles and laughter and assumed peace. She realized then that love was not enough. Not if it refused to look directly at the wound. Not if it made her feel more alone in a room full of people than she ever had in solitude. By now, the warmth she once hoped to find in his family had chilled into something brittle. And though nothing overt had been said, and no line had been crossed visibly, she felt it building, the pressure, the scrutiny, the sense that she was being watched, judged, measured against a standard no one had shared with her. Something was coming. She could feel it in the way her mother-in-law smiled too kindly, in the way plans were made without her input, in the way silence sometimes fell when she entered a room. It was a quiet storm gathering just beyond the horizon. And when it arrived, she knew, it wouldn't come with thunder. It would come with applause. The invitation arrived as casually as any other family message, just a short text from her mother-in-law, asking if they could come over for dinner that Sunday. No special occasion, nothing out of the ordinary, just a casual evening, a little family time. But something about it felt rehearsed. There was a tone in the message that didn't match its content, a kind of forced warmth, too smooth to be natural. Still, she agreed. There had been more tension than usual lately, and maybe this was a peace offering, a chance to reset things. Her husband seemed happy about it, relieved even, and she didn't want to bring her suspicions into their already strained conversations. The days leading up to the dinner were oddly quiet. No backhanded comments from his sister, no surprise visits from the mother-in-law, no awkward family group messages. It was as if everything had been wrapped in a blanket of unnatural calm. She wanted to believe it was genuine, but her instincts whispered otherwise. Something was being planned. She could feel it in the gaps between conversations, in the way her husband would glance at his phone and quickly put it away. She asked once what was going on, and he simply smiled and said his mother had just been trying to be more inclusive lately. That word, inclusive, echoed in her mind longer than it should have. 2 days before the dinner, her mother-in-law called. Her voice was cheerful, almost over the top, and she insisted that she wear something a little dressy for the evening, nothing too fancy but not too casual either. She said they were planning to take pictures, maybe even have a little surprise dessert, just something fun to brighten the mood. The words felt heavy. They weren't just planning a dinner, they were planning a scene. She didn't argue, just nodded and made a note to wear the blue dress her husband liked. The one his mother once said made her look a bit too modern. If they wanted a show, she could at least look the part. That Sunday, the weather was soft and overcast. As they drove to the house, she stared out the window, trying to slow the rapid pulse in her chest. Her husband hummed along to the music, relaxed, unaware. She wondered how he could be so at ease when everything around them felt like a stage being set. When they pulled into the driveway, the house was already glowing, lights on in every room, the front door slightly open as if anticipating their arrival. The smell of roasted meat and vanilla drifted through the air as they stepped inside. Everyone was already there, gathered in the living room, faces bright and too alert. Her father-in-law clapped her husband on the back and ushered him toward the kitchen. Her sister-in-law greeted her with a smile stretched a little too tight, then stepped aside to reveal the dining table already set with fine dishes and candles. There was a cake box on the counter, unopened but prominently displayed. The writing on top wasn't visible, but she could see the edges of pastel-colored frosting peeking through the lid. Her stomach twisted. It didn't make sense. There were no birthdays, no anniversaries, no holidays. Yet everyone was acting like something had already happened, like they were all in on a secret she hadn't been told. Her mother-in-law hovered nearby, offering her wine, complimenting her dress, brushing non-existent lint from her shoulder. The praise was cloying, laced with condescension, as if she were congratulating a child for showing up to school on time. Conversations drifted around her, low murmurs and occasional glances in her direction. She caught fragments, mentions of the future, of excitement, of plans being made. Each word landed like a stone in her gut. She felt like a guest at her own intervention, invited under false pretenses, surrounded by smiles that felt more like traps. Dinner was served with performative joy. Laughter rang out too loudly. Wine glasses clinked a little too deliberately, and no one mentioned what they were all clearly waiting for. She kept her face composed, her voice steady, though every part of her wanted to run. She glanced at her husband, who was engaged in light conversation with his brother, completely unaware of the thick tension around her. And then, just as plates were being cleared and dessert was about to be brought out, her mother-in-law stood and called everyone's attention. It was then she knew. Whatever this evening was really about, it was coming now. And whatever it was, she wasn't ready. The drive home was silent, but not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that echoed, each unspoken word bouncing off the windows and pressing into the space between them like invisible bricks. She sat rigid in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead, her hands clenched in her lap, jaw tight enough to ache. Her husband drove like someone trying to outrun something, eyes fixed on the road, gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. The air between them was heavy with confusion, anger, and a storm of emotions neither of them could name. Everything that had happened back in that house still rang in her head. The clapping, the cake, the way everyone looked at her as though her truth didn't matter. And the most haunting of all was the smile on his mother's face, that smug look of triumph thinly veiled by fake affection. When they finally reached home, and the door clicked shut behind them, it was like the dam broke. The room filled with a kind of raw tension that had no outlet. Her voice didn't rise, but it cut. She wanted answers, needed to understand how something so intimate, so personal, had been turned into a public stunt. Her husband tried to respond, but his words were clumsy, scattered, weighed down with disbelief. He swore he hadn't known, said he was as surprised as she was, said he thought the dinner was just a regular family night. But his confusion, no matter how genuine it seemed, didn't ease the sting. Because even if he hadn't known, someone had. And that someone had gone to great lengths to make sure she was left exposed. It wasn't just the act that hurt, it was the intention behind it. Someone had decided to write a false narrative of her life and cast her in it without permission. Someone had used the idea of pregnancy, something sacred and private, as a prop in their twisted game. She asked him if he believed her, if he believed she hadn't told anyone, if he really thought she would hide something so big from him. He said yes, of course he believed her. But the hesitation in his voice was enough to let doubt crawl into the room. It was small, quiet, but she felt it. The seed had been planted, and she knew exactly who had done it. The next morning she called his mother. There was no tremor in her voice. It was calm, deliberate, sharpened by betrayal. She didn't bother with greetings or niceties. She went straight to the point. The older woman didn't flinch. She didn't even pretend to be surprised. Instead, she let out a soft, almost condescending laugh and told her she was being too sensitive, that it had all been a joke, that she had just sensed the news and wanted to be the first to celebrate. But beneath the sweetness was something far colder. A smugness. A warning. A message delivered without needing to say it directly. You don't control the narrative here. She pressed further, pushing past the sugar-coated lies, demanding the truth. And finally it slipped. A sentence too honest to be accidental. She said she had to act because her son deserved better. That he was being distracted, wasting time, being pulled into a future with someone who didn't know how to be part of a real family. That faking the announcement was a way to wake him up, to shake things loose, to test how she would react when things got real. There it was. The truth, laid bare without apology. She hadn't been celebrating her, she'd been trying to break her. The call ended, but the damage had already deepened. Her husband stood in the doorway, having heard most of it. His face was unreadable, caught between loyalty to the woman who raised him and disbelief at what he'd just heard. She didn't wait for him to process it. She walked past him, her body stiff, her eyes dry. She felt like something inside her had been hollowed out. It wasn't just about what had been done. It was about who had let it happen, who had watched it unfold and said nothing, who had doubted, even for a second. In the days that followed, the house was filled with quiet tension. Conversations became brief, mechanical. Meals were eaten in silence. Their bed felt colder, wider. The laughter that once filled their space was gone, replaced now by suspicion, disappointment, and the weight of a truth too heavy to carry together. Something had broken. Not loudly, not all at once, but with quiet precision, like glass cracking beneath invisible pressure. And she knew that the crack would only spread unless something changed. She began to move differently after that. Not with rage or confrontation, but with a quiet, deliberate resolve. The kind of resolve that grows in people who have been humiliated and left to pick up the pieces of their dignity in silence. There were no dramatic ultimatums, no tearful breakdowns, only a calm retreat into observation. She stopped explaining herself. She stopped defending what didn't need to be defended. Instead, she began to listen more carefully, to watch more closely. Every interaction, every word exchanged with his family, became a thread she mentally catalogued. She no longer gave them the benefit of the doubt. She stopped hoping they might change. They had shown her who they were, and now she believed them. Her husband continued to hover in uncertainty. He was distant, guilt-ridden, often quiet when he should have spoken, but occasionally trying to make amends in small ways. He brought her coffee in the mornings, took over more of the chores, left little notes that said nothing and everything. But she didn't need apologies in whispers. She needed action in daylight. And she knew that if she waited for him to fully choose her, she would always be waiting. So she started choosing herself. She began documenting. It started with screenshots of messages, saving voicemails, noting the times and dates of conversations. There was no grand plan at first, only the instinct that something else was coming, something worse, and this time, she would not be caught defenseless. She needed proof. Not just for others, but for herself. She needed something to hold on to. Something real in the gaslit blur she had been dragged into. The evidence became a kind of armor. With every saved message and recorded call, she reclaimed a little more of her sanity. The final push came in the form of a rumor. It reached her through a distant cousin at a baby shower she hadn't planned to attend but forced herself to anyway. Her mother-in-law had told people that the pregnancy announcement was real, but that she had lost the baby and was now pretending it had never happened out of shame. She stood there, frozen, as someone casually relayed the story over punch and cupcakes. Her fingers went cold, her heart slow and steady, like the calm that comes before fire. She didn't cry. She didn't make a scene. She just smiled and excused herself, walking out of the house without saying goodbye. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with her laptop, compiling everything. The text from her mother-in-law confirming the dinner. The screenshot of her asking her to dress up. The voice message where she laughingly admitted she just had a feeling. The call they had after the confrontation, recorded with clarity, where she justified her actions with cold precision. She organized it all into a single folder, labeled it, and saved multiple copies. Not for revenge in the explosive sense, but for clarity, for power, for the moment when silence would no longer protect her. When she was ready, she arranged a small family gathering. Just her husband, his parents, and siblings. She didn't decorate, didn't serve drinks, didn't pretend it was anything other than what it was. When everyone had arrived and the room settled into that same performative calm, she connected her laptop to the TV and pressed play. One by one, she played the recordings. The screenshots were shown, the messages read aloud. Her voice was steady. No anger, no yelling. Just truth. Laid bare and undeniable. No one laughed this time. No one clapped. Her husband's face went pale. His sister stared at the floor. Her mother-in-law sat frozen, mouth slightly open, no words coming to her defense. And for the first time, the silence belonged to her. It wasn't the silence of dismissal or humiliation. It was the silence that follows a reckoning. The silence of people realizing they had underestimated someone who chose dignity over spectacle. She didn't wait for their responses. When it was over, she stood, gathered her things, and walked away. Her husband followed her to the car, speechless. He looked at her differently now. Not with pity, not with confusion, but with the dawning understanding that he had nearly lost something irreplaceable. And maybe he already had. Because something in her had shifted for good. She had stepped out of the story they wrote for her and reclaimed the pen. By the end of that night, the balance of power had changed. Not through manipulation or cruelty, but through truth. Quiet, cold, and undeniable. In the weeks that followed, everything became quieter, but not in the way it had before. This silence wasn't thick with tension or unspoken resentment. It was the silence that follows after something finally ends. Her husband moved through the house differently, careful, aware, no longer distracted by the false comfort of his family's approval. He had seen what she endured, not through her words but through the undeniable weight of proof she had placed in front of them all. There was no space left for excuses. No space for denial. He stopped defending what couldn't be defended. And while he didn't always have the right words, he started showing up differently, present, listening, choosing her in ways that mattered. But even that could not erase what had been broken. She didn't seek reconciliation with his family. They reached out in awkward, stammering ways. Half apologies wrapped in vague regrets. Attempts to downplay what had been done. But she didn't respond. Not out of spite, but out of clarity. Some relationships are not meant to be salvaged, especially those built on manipulation disguised as tradition. She blocked numbers, muted group chats, and removed herself from the small digital spaces where their voices might still try to reach her. What they had done had been too calculated, too personal. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It had been an attack wearing the mask of family. Her peace returned slowly. At first, it felt unfamiliar, like wearing someone else's coat. But day by day, she settled into it. She poured her energy into her work, her passions, her routines. She started therapy, not to process grief, but to strengthen her boundaries, to untangle the subtle guilt that had lingered long after the humiliation. She began to speak about what happened. Not online, not publicly, but in spaces where her story could exist without being twisted. And in doing so, she found other women who had been undermined, controlled, shamed by people they were told to call family. Their stories weren't identical, but the pain was familiar. It didn't heal her completely, but it made her feel less alone. Her husband chose to cut ties. It wasn't immediate, but it was deliberate. The confrontation had shifted something in him too. Forced him to examine the quiet ways he had allowed harm to pass as love. He apologized again, not just with words but with changed behavior. And though she didn't know what the future held for them as a couple, she saw the effort, the awareness, and that mattered. Whether they stayed together or not. She knew she would never again be the woman who begged to be believed. She would never again explain her pain to people committed to misunderstanding it. Then one afternoon, months after the dinner that changed everything, she received a letter. It was handwritten, in delicate cursive, and signed by her mother-in-law. The contents were everything she had expected. An apology laced with excuses. A plea for forgiveness without accountability. She read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it in a drawer she no longer opened. That letter wasn't for her. It was for the woman they thought she still was. The one who would second-guess her boundaries. The one who would come back. But that woman no longer lived in her skin. Her revenge had never been about destruction. It was about refusal. Refusing to be silenced. Refusing to stay small. Refusing to participate in the lie of harmony that demanded her silence in exchange for inclusion. By telling the truth, by reclaiming the narrative, by walking away with her head held high, she had already won. Her freedom wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was steady, lived in every quiet morning she spent without fear. Every decision she made without asking for permission. And as time passed, the memory of that pink cake, that fake celebration, that night of forced smiles and filmed humiliation began to lose its sting. It didn't disappear. But it transformed. It became a marker, a before and after. A moment not of collapse, but of awakening. And in that, she found a freedom far greater than anything they ever tried to take from her.